The Mothman is a mystery in American folklore, but it didn't start as a legend. It started as a series of panicked police reports in a small town in West Virginia. For a year, people claimed a humanoid creature with glowing red eyes was stalking them, appearing before disasters and vanishing into the woods. The official explanation was always a misplaced bird, but the witnesses described something that didn't fit any biology book. Was this a case of mass hysteria, or was something actually hunting the people of Point Pleasant? On November 15, 1966, two young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Mallett, were driving through a desolate part of the county. They were near what locals called the TNT area. And if late-night mysteries like this are your kind of rabbit hole, like the video and subscribe to Sleepwalk Files. This wasn't a nickname, it was the site of a former World War II munitions plant, a place of concrete bunkers and overgrown brush. As they drove, they saw something standing by the side of the road. Linda Scarberry described it as a slender, muscular man, about 7 feet tall, with massive white wings. The eyes glowed a deep, piercing red. Linda said she couldn't even make out the creature's face because those eyes had a hypnotic effect, locking her in place. Panic set in, and the couples floored it. As they sped away, they heard a screeching sound. The creature took flight and pursued their car, keeping pace with them all the way to the Point Pleasant city limits. Believers imagine the terror of that night as the entity refused to let them leave. The creature's ability to keep pace with a speeding vehicle suggested something far more powerful than a bird. A sighting like that could have been dismissed as a prank or a hallucination if it had stayed between four friends. But the next morning, November 16th, the local newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register, ran a story. The headline was hesitant, almost confused. Couples see man-sized bird. Creature, something. That headline acted like a signal. Once the public knew that others had seen something strange, the floodgates opened. People who had been keeping their experiences quiet realized they weren't alone. The mystery stopped being a one-time encounter in the woods and became a local phenomenon. Soon, other residents came forward with their own stories. Two volunteer firemen reported seeing a large bird with red eyes. Then there was a contractor named Newell Partridge. He told the Mason County Sheriff, George Johnson, that he had spotted a creature in a nearby field. When Partridge aimed his flashlight at it, the eyes glowed, specifically like bicycle reflectors. Partridge began connecting the creature to other strange things happening in his life. He reported hearing buzzing noises coming from his television set, and then his German Shepherd, a dog named Bandit, vanished. To Partridge, these were signs that whatever was in the fields was actively interfering with his home. The authorities tried to bring in experts to calm the town. A wildlife biologist from West Virginia University, Robert L. Smith, suggested an ordinary explanation. He pointed to the sandhill crane. A sandhill crane is a massive bird, almost as tall as a human, with a 7-foot wingspan and reddish skin around its eyes. If one had wandered off its migration route and ended up in West Virginia, a panicked person might mistake it for a monster. But for the people living in Point Pleasant, the crane theory felt too simple. A crane doesn't chase a car at high speeds toward the city limits. A crane doesn't make people feel hypnotized or cause their electronics to malfunction. When multiple witnesses, firemen, contractors, and young couples all described the same glowing red eyes and the same humanoid shape, the misplaced bird explanation feels like a cover-up or a misunderstanding. If it was just a bird, why did it seem to target specific people? And why was it always seen around the TNT area, a place designed for secrecy and explosives? The town was on edge. Every shadow in the woods looked like a wing, and every red light in the distance looked like a pair of eyes. The sightings were becoming more frequent and the descriptions more consistent. The creature was haunting the landscape. As the reports piled up, the local atmosphere shifted from curiosity to a genuine sense of dread. People began to wonder if the creature was a warning or a predator. The more the town talked, the more the creature seemed to evolve in their minds. It wasn't a man-sized bird anymore. It was becoming something more specific, something with a purpose. The residents of Point Pleasant were waiting for something to happen, though they didn't know what it was yet. They only knew that the thing with the red eyes was still out there, watching them from the edges of the forest. Mason County Sheriff George Johnson didn't see a monster. He saw a pattern of panic. To him, the reports of a man-sized bird weren't evidence of the paranormal, but a case of mistaken identity on a grand scale. He suspected the town was simply seeing an unusually large green heron, a bird that could easily startle someone in the dim light of the TNT area. He wasn't the only one looking for a biological answer. Robert L. Smith, a wildlife biologist at West Virginia University, stepped in with a more specific candidate, the sandhill crane. These are massive birds, almost as tall as a human, with a wingspan that reaches 7 feet. Most importantly, they have a distinct reddish coloring around their eyes. To a biologist, the math was simple. If a sandhill crane wandered off its usual migration route and ended up in Point Pleasant, it would be a complete stranger to the locals. It wouldn't look like the birds they knew. In the woods, under a flashlight or a flickering street lamp, a confused, out-of-place crane becomes a 7-foot humanoid with glowing eyes. It's a classic case of pareidolia. That's when your brain sees a familiar shape, like a face or a person, in a random pattern of light and shadow. Once the first few reports hit the papers, the town was primed to see a monster instead of a bird. But for some people, a misplaced crane didn't explain the rest of it. The sightings started to bleed into their daily lives in ways that a bird simply couldn't. Take Newell Partridge. He was a contractor who had his own run-in with the creature. He described aiming a flashlight into a nearby field and seeing eyes that glowed back at him like bicycle reflectors. That fits the bird theory. Many animals have a reflective layer behind the retina that bounces light back, but Partridge noticed things happening inside his own home that had nothing to do with the woods. He started hearing strange, persistent buzzing noises coming from his TV set. It was an interference that felt intentional, or at least unnatural. Then his German Shepherd Bandit vanished. The dog disappeared and Partridge blamed the creature. The Mothman was a sandhill crane? It could explain the red eyes and the wings, but a bird doesn't cause electronic interference. A bird doesn't systematically snatch pets from their yards while the TV buzzes in the living room. When you add those details, the misidentified animal theory starts to feel too small. The phenomenon was expanding. It wasn't something people were seeing in the distance anymore. It seemed to be interacting with the environment, affecting technology and taking things that belonged to the townspeople. The creature wasn't a bird or a hallucination. Then what was it actually doing in Point Pleasant? The sightings were becoming more frequent, and the atmosphere in town was shifting from curiosity to a genuine sense of dread. People weren't reporting a monster anymore. They were reporting a presence. As the sightings intensified, the town began to wonder if the creature was actually waiting for something. The panic in Point Pleasant stopped being about what people saw and started being about what they felt. These were practical, down-to-earth people, farmers and laborers who went to church on Sundays and didn't spend their time thinking about UFOs or monsters. But as the sightings of the creature with the red eyes continued, the fear began to leak into their daily lives in ways that didn't make sense. People started reporting something they called thought messages. It wasn't a voice they heard with their ears, but a sudden, intrusive feeling or a word that appeared in their minds. These messages were vague, but they all shared the same tone, a sense of impending dread. It was as if the creature was broadcasting a signal directly into their heads. Then the physical symptoms started. Some residents reported that their eyes were becoming inflamed, swollen, red, and irritated for no apparent medical reason. The detail that stood out to the community was the color. Their eyes were turning the same red as the eyes of the creature they had seen in the woods. When you see a strange animal, you call animal control. But when you start feeling the animal's traits inside your own body, the explanation changes. The town stopped treating the Mothman as a biological mistake or a misplaced bird. They began to see it as a psychological force, something that could reach inside a person and leave a mark. Some witnesses suffered genuine nervous breakdowns, becoming entirely different people than they had been before the encounters. As the mental strain grew, the conversation in Point Pleasant shifted. People stopped asking what the creature was and started asking why it was there. A theory took hold that this wasn't a monster, but an angel of death. In many old traditions, a supernatural visitor doesn't arrive to cause a disaster, but to announce one. They viewed the Mothman as a living warning sent to tell the village that something terrible was about to happen. The creature was a warning. The residents were trapped in a waking nightmare. They knew a catastrophe was coming, but they had no idea where it would strike or who it would take. The Mothman had become a clock ticking down to zero. Living in a town where your neighbor is convinced the air is filled with psychic warnings and your own eyes are stinging with a red glow creates a specific kind of tension, the kind that happens right before a storm breaks. The people of Point Pleasant weren't watching the skies anymore. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. They spent months looking for the disaster the omen had promised. They looked at the woods, the river, and the old TNT area where the creature was often spotted. But the warning didn't point to the forest. It pointed toward the center of town, toward the massive steel structure that connected them to the rest of the world. By November 15, 1966, the fear had reached a breaking point. The town was primed for a tragedy, and that night, the omen finally found its target. To understand how a bridge just vanishes from under 1,000 tons of steel and concrete, you have to look at the Silver Bridge. It spanned the Ohio River, connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia, to Gallipolis, Ohio. It was a beautiful piece of engineering for its time, finished in 1928 and coated in a bright aluminum paint that gave it that shimmering silver look. It was the gateway to the south, a vital link for Route 35. But under that shiny paint, the bridge was built on a gamble. The engineers used an I-bar chain suspension design. Now, if you think of a suspension bridge, you probably imagine those massive cables made of thousands of tiny wires twisted together. That's how the Brooklyn Bridge was built. If one wire snaps in the Brooklyn Bridge, it doesn't matter. There are thousands more to pick up the slack. That's what engineers call redundancy. It's a built-in backup system. If one part fails, the rest of the structure absorbs the shock so the whole thing doesn't come crashing down. The Silver Bridge didn't have that. Instead of thousands of wires, it used heavy steel bars with holes at the ends, shaped like eyes, pinned together in a chain. In the 1920s, a new kind of high-strength steel became available that was twice as strong as the steel used in older bridges. Because the material was so strong, the designers decided they didn't need as many bars. Most I-bar bridges of that era were built with 4, 6, or even 8 bars per link. If one bar cracked, the others would hold the weight. But the Silver Bridge was built with only 2 bars per link. The designers believed the high-strength steel made the extra bars unnecessary, so they traded redundancy for raw strength. This created a mathematical nightmare. By stripping away the backups, the bridge became a house of cards. If a single I-bar developed a flaw, even a tiny one, the entire load of the bridge would instantly shift to the one remaining bar in that link. That second bar wasn't designed to carry the full weight alone. It would buckle almost immediately, triggering a domino effect that would rip through the rest of the chain. The bridge was predisposed to a total, catastrophic collapse. It only took one point of failure to kill everyone on it. Knowing this, you'd assume the state would be obsessive about checking those bars on paper. They were. There were official inspections in 1959, 1963, 1964, 1965, and 1967. Inspectors walked the span and checked the steel for problems, but there was a gap between looking at a bridge and actually seeing its condition. The problem was that these were visual inspections. The inspectors looked for visible rust or obvious cracks on the surface, but the I-bars were pinned together tightly, and the most critical points of the structure were buried inside the joints, hidden from view. There was no way to dismantle the chains to see what was happening inside without shutting down the entire bridge, and there were no non-destructive testing tools available at the time to peer through the metal. A flaw could be eating away at the heart of a steel bar, and an inspector could stand right next to it and see absolutely nothing. It was a blind spot the size of a river. Investigators later found that the collapse was triggered by a flaw just 1/10 of an inch deep. A tiny fracture, barely a sliver of a crack, had formed in one of those eye bars. Because of the no-redundancy design, that invisible flaw was a death sentence. For years, the bridge carried thousands of cars a day while a microscopic crack grew in the dark, hidden from every state inspection. When you put this alongside the stories from Point Pleasant, the timing feels heavy. For months, people had been reporting a creature with red eyes, a herald of doom, stalking the town and appearing near the bridge. Skeptics call it a coincidence or mass hysteria triggered by the stress of the era. But the bridge's structure was a machine designed to fail in the most violent way possible. It makes you wonder if the panic in the town was a subconscious reaction to a looming disaster. If the bridge was a ticking time bomb, did the people of Point Pleasant feel the clock winding down? Or was something else watching that flaw grow, waiting for the exact moment the steel finally gave up? It was 5 p.m. on December 15, 1967. It was a cold Friday in Point Pleasant, and the Silver Bridge was packed with rush-hour traffic. People were trying to get home, crossing the Ohio River on a bridge that had been there for 39 years. Then the sound started. Witnesses described a deep metallic groaning coming from the structure. A few moments later, a noise like a loud gunshot ripped through the air. And in an instant, the bridge folded. One eyewitness described it as folding like a deck of cards. The entire main span plunged into the river, taking everything on it down into the dark water. The scene was immediate chaos. 32 cars vanished into the river in seconds. People on the shore rushed toward the edge, watching cars float downstream in the current. Rescue workers and locals dove into the freezing Ohio River, pulling out whoever they could reach, but the water was horrifically cold. By the time the recovery barges arrived the next day, the toll was clear. 46 people were dead. 2 of them were never found. They simply disappeared into the river. For the people of Point Pleasant, this was a punchline to a year of terror. For months, the town had been haunted by reports of the Mothman, that humanoid figure with the glowing red eyes. The creature had been sighted around the bridge, in the woods, and stalking the outskirts of town. Now, the thing the town had been dreading had happened in the most violent way possible. The tragedy provided a traumatic anchor for those strange sightings. It turned the Mothman from a local curiosity or a series of hallucinations into something that looked like a warning. The theory shifted. The creature hadn't been hunting people, it had been marking the site of a massacre. While the town was reeling, investigators were looking at the steel. They pulled the wreckage from the river and began a forensic analysis of the bridge's design. They discovered that the Silver Bridge was built with an eye-bar chain setup. To understand this, you have to think about redundancy. In most bridges, if you have a cable, it's made of thousands of tiny wires. If a few wires snap, the others hold the weight. That's redundancy. The Silver Bridge didn't have that. It used a 2-link bar setup. It was cheaper and lighter, but there was no backup. If one single link failed, the entire section of the bridge became reliant on the other link. If that one failed too, the whole thing came down. The investigators found the culprit, a single eye bar. When they examined the metal, they found a flaw, a microscopic crack. This defect was only 0.1 inches deep, about 2.5 millimeters. A flaw so small you could barely see it with the naked eye had held the weight of the bridge for decades, slowly deepening until it finally gave way. The official report was clear. A microscopic physical defect, not a supernatural force, killed 46 people. The math worked. The physics were sound. The tragedy was the result of a cheap design and a lack of non-destructive testing. At the time, inspectors could only check what they could see with their eyes. If a crack was hidden inside the metal or tucked away where a flashlight couldn't reach, it didn't exist until the moment it broke. But for those who had seen the red eyes in the woods, the physics didn't erase the timing. They wondered why the flaw happened to fail right then, after nearly 40 years. They wondered why the sightings of the creature peaked exactly as the bridge reached its breaking point. If the Mothman was a harbinger, it didn't matter if the cause was a bolt or a ghost, the result was the same. This left the town in a strange place. They had a scientific answer that explained the how, but it didn't satisfy the why. The disaster left a scar on the community, and they began to look at every strange occurrence as a sign of impending doom. They asked if the creature was a psychic echo of the event, or if it could actually sense the structural fatigue of the world around it. As the wreckage was cleared and the funerals ended, the Mothman sightings didn't stop. They changed. The creature was no longer a monster in the woods. It had become a symbol of the unpredictable. It was now associated with the most traumatic day in the town's history. As the years passed, the story of the Silver Bridge drifted away from the engineering reports and into the folklore of the valley. The question was no longer whether the bridge was safe, but whether the thing that watched it fall was still watching them. For a few years after the collapse, the tragedy of the Silver Bridge and the sightings of the creature were two separate stories. One was a matter of grief and engineering. The other was a local curiosity about a man-sized bird. But in 1975, a writer named John Keel published a book called The Mothman Prophecies. Keel didn't see these as separate events. He linked the paranormal sightings to the bridge collapse, claiming the creature was a harbinger. He argued that the sightings were part of a larger series of supernatural events that predicted the disaster. By putting these two things in one book, Keel codified the legend. He took a series of panicked reports and a structural failure and welded them together into a single narrative. Once the book hit the shelves, the Mothman was a prophet of doom. But if we step away from the prophecy and look at the steel, the story changes. To understand why the Silver Bridge fell, you have to look at how it was built compared to something like the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge was designed with an obsession with redundancy. It is a simple engineering concept. It means having a backup for your backup. If one part fails, other parts are ready to take the load, so the whole thing doesn't come crashing down. The Brooklyn Bridge had a safety factor of 6. It had thousands of redundant wires. If a few wires snapped or were made of substandard metal, the bridge wouldn't even flinch because so many other wires held the weight. The Silver Bridge was built with a different philosophy. It prioritized strength over redundancy. It used eye-bars, which are heavy steel links shaped like long bars with a hole at each end. Instead of thousands of wires, the bridge relied on these few massive bars. This design creates a single point of failure. If one bar snaps, the load doesn't spread across a web of wires. It jumps instantly to the next bar, which then has to carry more weight than it was ever designed for. That bar snaps, and then the next one, and the whole chain zips open in a fraction of a second. While the engineering was failing in silence, the legend was being shaped by the world around it. Even the name Mothman tells us something about the time. When the sightings first hit the Point Pleasant Register in November of 1966, the reports described a man-sized bird or a slender, muscular man with wings. But as the story grew, the names shifted. At the time, the Batman TV series was a massive cultural phenomenon. The public was obsessed with Batman and his rogues gallery of colorful villains. One of those comic book characters was called Killer Moth. Some suggest that the local newspapers, influenced by the pop culture of the 60s, simply borrowed the name from the comics. The creature didn't arrive as the Mothman. The town renamed it based on what they were seeing on their TV screens. This creates an overlap between a comic book villain, a misunderstood crane, and a collapsing bridge. In the investigation reports, the disaster comes down to a flaw just 0.1 inches deep in a single eye-bar. That tiny crack, a fraction of a millimeter, was enough to trigger the entire collapse. Consider a different version of that day in December 1967. If the engineers had followed the design of the bridges in Pittsburgh or the Clifton Suspension Bridge, they would have used rows of 4 to 6 eye-bars per link, or even 8. If the Silver Bridge had been built with 3 or more eye-bars per link, the failure of that one flawed bar wouldn't have been a death sentence. The other bars would have absorbed the shock. The bridge would have groaned, maybe sagged, but it wouldn't have fallen. 46 people would have driven across the Ohio River and gone home for dinner. When you put those two things together, the prophecy starts to look like something else. The Mothman didn't predict a supernatural disaster. He appeared at a time when a known engineering vulnerability was waiting to snap. The creature was seen in the TNT area and around the town, and then the bridge fell. We call it a prophecy because it feels more meaningful than a coincidence. It's easier to believe in a monster that warns us of death than to believe that our lives can be ended by a 0.1-inch crack in a piece of painted steel. We have two versions of those few months in West Virginia. In one, a humanoid entity from another dimension or a distant star arrives to signal a coming tragedy. In the other, a confused sandhill crane wanders off its migration route. The local papers use a comic book name to describe it, and a bridge built without enough backups finally reaches its breaking point. Both stories explain the deaths of those 46 people. One gives the tragedy a reason, the other gives it a cause. But there's a detail the engineering reports can't touch. The people who saw the creature didn't describe a bird. They described a hypnotic red-eyed presence that chased them in their cars and made them feel a sense of overwhelming dread. If it was just a bird and a bad bridge, why does the memory of that creature still feel so heavy in Point Pleasant? Why does the town still hold a festival for a monster that might have just been a mistake in a blueprint? Did the creature appear because the bridge was going to fall? Or did we just need the creature to make sense of a world where a single tiny flaw can wipe out dozens of lives in an instant? You enjoyed this episode? Subscribe to Sleepwalk Files to stay up to date with new mysteries and long videos to fall asleep to every night.